Welcome to This Week in Money. I'm Jim Goddard. Today, Bob Hoye from chartsandmarkets.com runs down the major markets, gold, and tells us what the current credit spreads are indicating. The new year could be bumpy. James Corbett from the Corbett Report checks in from Japan. He comments on what is being called the Great Reset. Are we headed for a world where cash is banned, most assets and debts are wiped out, leaving you with just a basic guaranteed income and little else? John Rubino, author of the book The Money Bubble, talks about the US dollar, gold, silver, and what you should do should some of the things James Corbett is worried about come true. Plus, at the end of the show, we'll have a company showcase update from American Manganese President Larry Reaugh. We'll talk to Bob Hoye right after this.
Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications. Patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Reaugh, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome to This Week in Money, the source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is market historian Bob Hoye, the chief investment strategist for chartsandmarkets.com. Welcome back to This Week in Money, Bob.
Yeah, good to be with you, Jim. Also, looking over our shoulder, it was an interesting week in the markets. Hey, thanks. What week isn't?
Yeah, well, I was going to say the week started off really strongly with the news that they could have viable vaccines. Yeah. But since that news, what's happened?
Just sort of sideways to slightly down. You've had supportive action in base metal prices. Copper's been acting well. Also supportive action in crude oil, firm to steady. And even the old grains, which had been in a bear market for more than a decade, earlier in the year gave a good buy signal, and the agricultural commodities have been doing well, maybe getting a little toppy in here now. What else has been helpful for the stock market? Credit spreads have been narrowing, which is plus. Actually, we should mention, Jim, that in highly speculative markets, which we are in, there's a tendency in the fall that if there's something going to go wrong, it'll be discovered in the fall, like a liquidity problem. And this is where you had, from the really terrific highs in the stock market in early September, you have this period of correction. But there was no liquidity concerns or crisis, mainly because the central bankers have been humping lots of money into the money markets. But what really happened in the stock market is that every bit of news came out, the street took it as positive. So at one time it was something with the election, and then another time it was something else, and then it was this, that, and the other thing. But everything ended up to being taken slightly positive. But we have had a correction phase going on, and what we're looking for now is that in a volatile market like this, it's unusual to have a quiet rollover and decline. So what is possible now is that good speculative moves can often conclude, late December, early January, that kind of thing. And that was the case with the fabulous speculation in the Tokyo market, with the Nikkei flying up to the very last trading day of 1989. And then you've had other important big speculative markets conclude in January. How about gold and silver in January 1980? That was a spectacular one. So this is what we do now. We look for the next possible rise in enthusiasm, and then one might look around for some news that might be with that enthusiasm. And on December 14th in the U.S., their electoral college decides on who will have won the presidency. And the way things are going with the scandal, actually it's a horrendous scandal on manipulating votes and ballots and making those for Trump diminish, and at the same time the algorithms in the voting machines were adding to the count for Biden, and then that wasn't working well enough because there was such a surge in popularity for Trump that then the Democrats had to come in with, shall we say, box loads of ballots. So this will be pursued in the courts, which is good because constitutionally the election ended on November the 3rd. And what the Democrats are trying to do is have the election on the day that's convenient to them when they can marshal enough votes to make it look like they win. And then, of course, a number in the media are going on about they declared Biden win, but the Electoral College does that. And so I think the U.S. will be able to cleanse itself of this atrocity in the electoral system, and any positive there would be a plus for the market, and so maybe we could have a bit of a speculative high in January, and then we got to look at the markets themselves, which have been overpriced for a long time. There's an economic slowdown going on. The authorities are again using influenza to shut down the economy, which is irresponsible. So anyways, it's going to be very interesting as we go into December, particularly December 14th with the Electoral College meeting.
What's going on with credit spreads, and does it mean anything this time?
Oh, gosh, when you had the problem with the high in the stock market last January, which, believe it or not, in early January, we were noting the technical excesses and saying that this could correct. And if it corrects, it would slow the economy as well. And then along came the Wuhan flu virus and the very communist reaction to it to shut everything down. Then you had a sudden crash in employment and economy and all that sort of stuff. But it sort of got a bit by there, and this is actually one of the excuses for a nice rally recently was the announcement that a vaccine was very close to being administered. So, as I said, there was the street decided that every news item would be more or less positive, but this has then left us with huge high valuations on the stock market and a lot of money coming from printing presses from the government, still severe employment problems. So, but with our work, as you know, Jim, our technical tools are very good at getting the oversolds when it's time to buy, and the overboughts when it's time to lighten up a little. And then within this, of course, the gold sector has been terrific, and this one is also one of our specialities where we expected the real price of gold, that's adjusted for inflation, to decline with the bubble. And decline it did down into 2018. And then when it got past that and started the rally, this would really enhance the gold mining sector such that gold stocks would outperform the S&P. And indeed, the rally in gold stocks has been almost twice as good as the rally in the S&P coming out of the March disaster. So one of the things we've been working on was that once the real price of gold turned up, then the gold stocks would begin to outperform all other sectors in the stock market, and it's outperforming the S&P, which is terrific. So, and we expect this to continue, of course, with some corrections, because in July and August, the action in the gold stocks got really overdone, triggering off from our technical alert signals, where we advised it would be best to take a little money off the table because the gains had been so good. So now we're sitting waiting to reposition on at some point over the next little while when gold gets a little weaker. We'll be ready for it. So, Jim, the markets are fascinating. And it's always better to comment on it looking over your shoulder at what has been. But overall, the stock markets are highly priced, in the hands of speculators, and it makes the very long term rather risky. Now it happens to be an ideal market for traders, which can profit from the volatility, and we have investors as our subscribers, and also we have a number of trading desks as well. So it's always kind of interesting each week.
Bob, thank you so much for the update.
Well, there we go, and we look forward to another opportunity.
My guest has been market historian Bob Hoye. He's the chief investment strategist for chartsandmarkets.com. Coming up, James Corbett reports from Japan next on This Week in Money.
Always consult your investment professional before making any investment decision.
Abin Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia and the Yukon, trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the OTCQB, symbol ABNAF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Abin's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at abinresources.com.
This Week in Money is archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com.
Welcome back. My guest is James Corbett, publisher of thecorbettreport.com. He's speaking to us from Japan, where he has worked and lived since 2004. Welcome back to This Week in Money.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here again.
James, you've been working on a number of documentaries. What's your latest?
I've got a couple of things on the go at the moment. I'm working on a mini documentary. It won't be so long, but it will hopefully have a lot of information about the bioterrorist threat that obviously is peeking its head out during this COVID era, and what the real roots of that are, and examination of what happened back in 2001 that a lot of people might forget about with regards to the anthrax attack. So I'm working on a report on that. I'm also presenting at the JFK Lancer Conference, which generally is held in Dallas on the anniversary of JFK's assassination on November 22nd, but this year is, of course, taking place online, as everything else is. So I will be presenting to the JFK Lancer Conference about the JFK Silver Certificate myth, which should be interesting, and hopefully I'll be able to post that to my own YouTube channel and other outlets in the near future.
Who shot JFK?
Good question. Luckily, I don't have to answer that question in my presentation. I'm just talking about silver certificates and the dollar and monetary history.
What's the Great Reset?
The long story short, the simple thing is to not listen to my my take on it or anyone else's, to go to the horse's mouth. And you can go to the World Economic Forum's website at weforum.org, and they have a page set up to talk about the Great Reset. But long story short, as Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum has announced, this crisis that we're living through is the perfect opportunity to perform a quote-unquote Great Reset of the Earth, essentially, including our economic system, our monetary paradigm, our social fabric, our geopolitical stances and policies. Every major thing that you can think about the way that you live your life is coming under review right now. And the most important thing I think to understand about this is that this is framed as being a response to what is happening this year, but it is not actually that. This is part of a larger idea that has been promulgated by outlets like the World Economic Forum for years. This is just the perfect opportunity to present it to a public that is increasingly freaked out about what's happening around them and looking for solutions and answers from, the very same types of people who have caused a lot of the problems that we're seeing right now.
I don't recall anybody campaigning recently saying we're going to go to the Great Reset, but we have some questions about that. Is COVID-19 part of the so-called Great Reset?
Only insofar as it is the perfect excuse for a pre-planned agenda. And in fact, we've seen this, of course, I think quite famously in recent days in Canada, with Trudeau coming out and announcing the Great Reset and how this is a perfect opportunity for reset, adopting that exact same language. But the interesting part about Trudeau's statement, when you examine it, is that specifically what he was saying pertained to a pre-planned as he called it, quote-unquote, pre-planned, or pre-pandemic, I believe was the term that he used, pre-pandemic agenda for changing our social and economic fabric. That's the key part of this. This is part of a long-term stratagem that's been in place for a very long time. It is just a convenient way to get the public on board with that. And in fact, Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum that is really leading the charge on this Great Reset idea, admits as much in his book on the Great Reset, which somehow or other he managed to write within the first few months of this pandemic crisis. I wonder if this was already basically ready to go. In which he wrote, "The spread of infectious diseases has a unique ability to fuel fear, anxiety, and mass hysteria. In so doing, as we have seen, it also challenges our social cohesion and collective capacity to manage a crisis. Epidemics are by nature divisive and traumatizing." And then he goes on to talk about how epidemics throughout history have had the effect of drastically changing and rewriting the social contract and economic understandings, etc., and basically lusting after the opportunity to do that in a conscious way here, which I suppose may sound great, because at the very least I think we can all agree that the system as it was functioning before was not functioning perfectly, but the devil, as always, is in the details.
Are vaccines part of the global reset?
Yeah, certainly the vaccine, it is one part of what this global Great Reset is about. And again, there's no speculation about that. One can go to the Great Reset transformation map that the World Economic Forum has provided. For people who haven't seen this yet, this is part of this spaghetti graph type thing where from the central hub of the Great Reset, you have all of the related concepts. And of course, one of them has to do with big pharma and vaccine manufacturing. That is part of what is happening right now, but it is only one part of an interconnected series of things. And I think people might miss the forest for the trees if they only see that one particular aspect of what's happening, although obviously that's front and foremost in a lot of people's minds right now, given the craziness of 2020 and the COVID-19 hysteria. But I think people need to start looking a bit longer term down the road as to what this implies towards the way they will be working and living their lives in a post-pandemic, quote-unquote, society.
Are you going to be lining up to get a COVID vaccine?
Let's look at the actual specific ones that are on the table right now, and the ones that have been receiving the press in the last few days are Moderna and Pfizer's contributions to the COVID vaccine race, and both of those are examples of mRNA vaccines, which is messenger RNA vaccines, that do not function like any other vaccine that has ever been approved for human use in history. These are experimental novel techniques for not only for producing vaccines, but in terms of the mechanism by which these vaccines function. Most vaccines involve giving an attenuated virus or in some way a pathogen that directly stimulates the immune system, so in order to train the immune system for future fights, as it were. Well, this one actually does something different. It injects messenger RNA into your cells so that your cells will essentially be tricked into producing the proteins, like the spike protein that we're told is the main mechanism by which COVID-19 starts to infect the body, so that the immune system will then find those spike proteins and start creating an immune response to them. So in effect, it is hijacking your body's own response in order to create something that the body will recognize as a virus-like or a foreign invader. Again, this is an untested, unproven technology. Generally, vaccines take years, if not decades, to actually bring to fruition through careful testing. This one is going to be rushed into people's arms within the space of 1 year. It seems insane from any perspective other than the perspective that what we are facing is some sort of existential threat to humanity itself, which I find a bit perplexing personally, given the 99.8 or 9% survival rate that people have as a result of COVID-19 infection. I for one, am going to be hanging out on the sidelines just to see if maybe a few years down the road we might start seeing reverse transcription of RNA into DNA, literally genetically encoding us in a different way. Call me a crazy conspiracy theorist, but I have my concerns about the way this is being rushed to market.
I recall after the second Gulf War, a lot of veterans came down with mysterious ailments because they had to take a cocktail of vaccines and shots that were supposedly going to make them immune to anthrax or other biological threats. Is that something we could be looking at?
That is an exceptionally important part of this longer-term story, and not just in a tangential way. The anthrax vaccines that were coming under scrutiny at that time were being manufactured by a firm called Bioport, which was actually facing economic ruination as a result of the backlash that was growing against the anthrax vaccines, and the potential, was this linked to that Gulf War syndrome? What was that? And there were investigations starting. But actually, Bioport was saved, quote unquote, by the anthrax attacks of 2001, which necessitated the buying of large stocks of their anthrax vaccines, which helped the company survive, and the company changed names and still survives to this day, and is in fact an incredibly important part of the various American government programs that are in place right now to provide therapeutics for the COVID-19 hysteria. So there is actual historical linkages there with some of the same players. And I would just, even for the most credulous in the crowd who trust absolutely anything that the government says should be put into their arms, I would also invite them to wonder why there was the headlong rush to give legal immunity to the vaccine manufacturers in the event that the COVID vaccine is approved. Why is it such an important part to make sure that the vaccine manufacturers cannot be sued for any complications that may arise from those vaccines?
Would a one world communist government be run by psychopaths? And is that one world government a goal of this so-called global reset?
It's a kind of a loaded question, but yes, I think we have to pick apart both aspects of that. Is one world government a part of the global reset agenda? And in the long term, yes, I think this is demonstrably where we are heading. And of course, it would be quibbled with by the people who are interested in the semantics. No, it's not one world government, it's one world governance, as in a rules-based international order, etc., the type of neoliberal globalist rhetoric that we've been hearing for decades now, which we have seen the economic position that it's pushed most of the world into, and any and all opposition to that is painted as either crazy conspiracy theorizing or as outright terrorism. And I think we saw the template of that being laid back in the battle in Seattle back in 2000, and people who were against the World Trade Organization and the types of things that were coming in at that time were of course portrayed as essentially terrorists of one form or another. And I think people would be best served by actually reading what these people are advocating. So again, go back to the source. Go to the World Economic Forum and start listening to their Great Reset podcast and see if that lines up with this one world government conspiracy theory, quote unquote, that we've been hearing about for years. As to the question of psychopathy, it isn't one that I take lightly. I think it is an extremely important thing that we should look at, and we should look at from the actual scientific literature on the subject, including the studies that have come out in recent years to show that there is a higher percentage of psychopathy in positions of corporate leadership and in positions of government. And politicians tend to be more on the psychopathic scale, shall we say. So there really is something behind that, and I have done work on that. So if people type psychopathy into the search bar on CorbettReport.com, you can find examples of interviews that I've done with researchers, for example, on that topic, and reports that I've done more broadly on the subject of political psychopathy and why people who are attracted to positions of power tend to be psychopaths, whereas regular people who are not so interested in ruling over others tend to shun such positions. I think there is something it speaks to the mindset of people who want to put themselves in positions of power.
I guess we just have to look at Kim Jong-un, Stalin, and Hitler as people like that.
We could add many more to the list, but those would be good places to start, yeah.
Under a one world communist government, would financial markets be destroyed?
I don't think that the goal is really the destruction of financial markets altogether, but certainly the destruction of the average person's participation in those financial markets, except through controlled mechanisms, like, for example, your state or provincial pension fund or what have you, something along those lines. But the average person's access to financial markets will be greatly hindered and greatly controlled under a one-world, rules-based international order system of governance, i.e. global government. And again, there's a lot that needs to be fleshed out there, but I think we see examples of that in the consolidation of control on the monetary side of things, which will be, I think, the first order of consolidation that will ultimately, essentially, all the other consolidation and centralization of control will be predicated on that. And we see that specifically in the increasing talk directly connected with the Great Reset talk. The head of the IMF is now hosting conferences with people like Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve and other key banking officials who are advocating for the central bank digital currencies, which will be the underlying monetary paradigm going forward into the 21st century. And based on that, our access to financial markets will be controlled essentially at the door. And I think that's really the aspect of it. There will be a market and there will be people playing in it. It will just be a very controlled market, essentially for the multi-billionaires and the billionaire class. And the average person will only have the sort of distance, at a distance, attempt to play in those markets.
A lot of businesses right now won't handle cash. They say they're worried that it might convey COVID. Is this just training us to get used to nothing but electronic money where the government monitors every transaction you make and perhaps taxes it?
Yes. Ultimately, the answer to that is yes. And this is another thing that I've been following quite closely for almost the entirety of the time I've been doing the website, 13 years now. If you type cashless society into my search bar, you'll see reports that I've been doing for many years now about the various ways that use of cash has been increasingly discouraged by governments around the world. But certainly we are seeing an acceleration of that right now, and that takes many different forms, including even the coin shortage that the Federal Reserve in the United States has been warning Americans about. And, we're going to, it's so much easier to just scan your card or your phone or whatever the case may be. We are seeing a concerted effort to move over to electronic payments. I'm not sure about day-to-day life in Canada at the moment, but I can tell you in Japan there's a lot of government incentives even to provide discounts if you pay with electronic means. There's a concerted push for that, and precisely the underlying point is why, and I think you point towards the reason why. It is because obviously every transaction can be surveilled when it is done electronically. Also, it can be controlled in various different ways. For example, we are starting to see people being deplatformed from the Patreons and PayPals and other platforms for facilitating electronic payments. Well, if your business is not approved by the would-be approvers of, I guess, everything that's taking place in the economy, you can be instantly, essentially, taken off of the monetary grid, which is increasingly becoming a life and death scenario for people. I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to see where this is going and to see how your participation in a completely cashless society could be dependent on, say, your social credit score, like what happens in China. I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to see where this is heading. It's just, unfortunately, a lot of people are afraid, I think, to look at the implications of what's happening right now.
Of course, if everything's electronic, what happens if some pulsed weapon is used that shuts down the electric grid, or just some natural disaster, a giant forest fire or earthquake? If everything's electronic, how do you transact anything?
We are increasingly becoming dependent on electronics, not just monetary, but in every sense, in all parts of our lives. So yes, we are increasingly vulnerable to the types of electromagnetic pulses that, of course, can be generated by strategically detonated nuclear bombs and that sort of thing, but it can also take place naturally, just through solar flares and the types of things that we have seen in the past before we had the complicated electronic infrastructure that we have now that could literally end the civilization as we know it in a moment. It does seem a bit crazy that we're rushing so headlong into such a potentially, at the very least, there is the potential for a catastrophic event to really wipe out everything that we know in an instant.
Yeah, you're probably referring to the solar flare that hit back in the 1800s and fried all the telegraph systems. The only electronic thing we had back then. We'll have more with James Corbett when we come back with more This Week in Money.
Value from success, growth, and discovery. Golden Arrow Resources is a well-funded gold-copper exploration company with proven management and prospective properties in Chile, Argentina, and Paraguay. Golden Arrow trades on the Toronto Venture Exchange, symbol GRG, on Frankfurt, symbol G6A, and the OTCQB, symbol GARWF. For more information, visit us at goldenarrowresources.com or call Sean at 778-686-0135.
This Week in Money is archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, why is the catchphrase "Build Back Better" being used by a number of political parties across the world?
Because it is precisely the type of political blather that sounds good and means nothing, or at the very least means whatever you want it to mean. So, of course, we all want to build back in the wake of any sort of catastrophe or setback, and we might as well build back better. Well, sounds good, and it alliterates, so it will be swallowed by people who like catchy marketing jingles, but what does it actually mean? And of course, as always, the devil is in the details. Why is it being adopted so widely and by so many different politicians in so many different countries? Now that is a more interesting question because it speaks to the fact that there is a coordination that is going on right now that I think actually extends beyond just the World Economic Forum, although that's, I think, the most visible part of this Great Reset agenda and is clearly the ones that are sort of spearheading the idea, or at least the public face of this idea. But it, as you say, it's popping up in Canada, it's popping up in the United States, it's popping up in England, it's popping up all around the globe. Why is that? And I think it speaks to the fact that this is part of an agenda. It's not the only example of political blather that is being widely adopted, though. In fact, if you do delve into the Great Reset materials at the World Economic Forum's website, you're going to see a lot of talk about ESG, environmental, social, and governance responsibility of corporations and how we can hold them to greater account to move forward into stakeholder capitalism and blah, blah, blah. This is the type of rhetoric you're going to see on the World Economic Forum website, which again is a lot of talk that essentially boils down to centralization of control in fewer and fewer hands. If they came out and said that, let's centralize more control in the hands of the few megacorporations and their political cronies, I don't think that would sell quite as well. So Build Back Better sounds a lot better, doesn't it?
Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke online at the United Nations in September. He said the opportunity provided by COVID-19 for a reset, this is a chance to accelerate our pre-pandemic efforts. Your thoughts on this, and is Trudeau a danger to Canada?
Well, I would hesitate to put this at the feet of any one particular politician, because as I say, this is, I think, a coordinated agenda that's being forwarded on many fronts. And, I mean, there are many examples, even just within the Liberal Party at the moment, where you could point to people who are very much on board with this agenda and where it's going, like Chrystia Freeland and others. So I don't think it's Trudeau per se. It is the ideas that he is acting as the forward public face of at the moment, including, of course, as you say, the Great Reset, the opportunity provided by COVID for a reset. And again, as you point out, the chance to accelerate our pre-pandemic efforts, i.e. this is an agenda that was already in place. This is just a convenient excuse to forward it. So I think we have to address the underlying ideology behind this. And that ideology can be seen most clearly in the types of economic effects, at least the first order economic effects that the lockdowns and shutdowns and mandates and rules that are going into place are having on, disproportionately, of course, on small businesses and medium-sized businesses that are struggling to maintain, to keep their doors open, literally or virtually, during this disruption, versus the large corporations which are being given the pass. Well, you are essential and you're essential to the functioning. So, of course, I mean, the famous examples that are going on around right now internationally, I mean, Amazon has greatly grown in terms of its ultimate net worth during this crisis. Why is that? Why is Amazon growing, Walmart growing, these gigantic mega corporations, whereas a lot of other regular businesses are shutting their doors forever? I think that really needs to be addressed, and we don't understand that if we only listen to Build Back Better and Great Reset and other blathering phrases like that. We have to look at the ideology, and that ideology isn't coming from Trudeau per se. It's coming from people like Trudeau all around the world who are forwarding this ideology of centralization of control.
Is Trudeau's position and that of the Great Reset a concern for Canada's economy, financial markets, and real estate market?
Yes, insofar as the agenda here really touches on every aspect of our lives, economic and otherwise, I think, yes, what we are being presented with essentially is an ultimatum. It's the deal that you can't refuse. We'll let you keep your economy of some sorts as long as you allow us to basically set the rules for the way that economy is going to function from here on out. And, oh, by the way, the big corporations will, of course, be privileged at all times. That is, to me, the real threat. Because, of course, if the ideology is aiming at centralization of control, then the only real answer to that, the only real response is decentralization and trying to prop up the small businesses and the people who are not mega corporations playing the billionaire game. That needs to be supported. So to the extent that this Great Reset is essentially resetting those types of small enterprises out of existence, I think that is a genuine threat, not only to Canada's economy, but to Canada's economy as well.
Could the Great Reset lead to the balkanization of North America?
It certainly could. I think nothing is off the table at this point. There's a lot of things that are going on right now that would have been unthinkable even a few years ago. So it is conceivable that the North America that we have unknown in our lifetime could change in the coming years. And I wouldn't venture to speculate what that would look like, but obviously there are the various movements, the Cascadias and others, and breaking up California and other ideas that have been forwarded. I don't know if it would necessarily play out like that, but we are going to see, I think, some pretty tectonic shifts in the economic markets, in the financial and monetary paradigms, and in the political and geopolitical situation. So the balkanization of North America is not something that I would balk at. I think it is truly something that could happen, depending again on the 18,000 variables that are all up in the air right now.
Should all of this geopolitical uncertainty be good for gold and silver in 2021?
I think so, yes. But I hesitate to take any delight in that because I'm reminded of that scene in The Corporation, that documentary where the trader admitted that his first thought on the morning of 9/11 was, wow, I wonder what gold's at right now. Because, yes, in times of crisis, obviously gold and silver and precious metals have historically been safe havens that people flock to, and we've seen that. In fact, I experienced that even here in Japan, and I know it's happened elsewhere around the world during this year of COVID craziness. Back in March and April when the world was starting to shut down and people were starting to realize that the world was changing forever, there was a rush on physical purchases of precious metals, and I experienced that even here in Japan. So it is definitely, we've seen it already, and I think, obviously, given the fact that this uncertainty is not going to decrease in the near term, it is only going to increase, I think that it's a pretty safe bet that this is going to have an upward effect on gold and silver. The only real question is how much, and what will it look like after it settles out? And will they be able to maintain the current paradigm and the status quo, or will this be a breaking point of some sort where some new virtual currency is introduced and suddenly gold and silver can't even be measured in physical dollars anymore? And what would that mean for their nominal price?
What's the latest on China?
Actually, the most interesting thing that I've seen in the last 24 hours on the China front comes not from China, but from Washington. Specifically, Axios has published a State Department document called The Elements of the China Challenge from the Policy Planning Staff of the Office of the Secretary of State. And essentially what this lays out is a type of Cold War containment strategy type of document that lists the things that the United States is going to have to do in order to counter the growing Chinese threat. And for me, I think this does set the blueprint for the coming years, regardless, really, whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration. I think Biden obviously participating in the Obama-Biden administration with the Asia-Pacific pivot back in 2009 and under the Hillary Clinton State Department. I think quite obviously on board with this agenda for the so-called containment of China, and I think that's going to be an increasingly important part of geopolitics as we enter this new era where everything's on the table. So really, I think that's the perspective geopolitically, but of course, there are so many questions that go along with that, for example, economically. And can China continue its space that it's occupied for the past couple of decades, I should say, as the up-and-coming economic juggernaut, the unstoppable juggernaut that's using that to convert into a geopolitical giant? Is this really going to eventuate now that the world is grinding to some sort of COVID-19 related halt? And how will China maintain that, given that they're still a heavily export-dependent economy in this increasingly shuttered-down world? That could throw a giant monkey wrench into any plans for any sort of stratagem, geopolitically or otherwise. It's going to be interesting to watch. Unfortunately, I don't have a set pat answer for you because it really does depend on so many variables. But I think that the China-U.S. conflict, or at least the specter of that, is going to be increasingly important from here on out.
I've seen reports where China used a microwave weapon to chase Indian troops off some mountaintops in the Himalayas. In essence, turning it into an open-air microwave oven. Is that something we should fear from China?
I have heard, I've seen those headlines as well. I haven't looked deeply into the story, so I don't know how well sourced they are. But that type of technology certainly exists and is possible and has been employed by other militaries as well. For example, I think most famously, the American military has not only developed that for use in Afghanistan and other places, but actually brought it home in terms of the LRAD and other types of weapon systems that are now used on domestic populations when there is civil unrest. So this type of technology exists. It's going to be increasingly used on battlefields in warfare, which is why another reason why I think warfare of the 21st century is not going to look anything like warfare of the 20th century, and it's going to involve just as much of a revolution as aircraft carriers and other inventions of the 20th century revolutionized 20th century warfare. That's going to happen again in the 21st century because of technologies like this, not just Chinese, but American and Russian and everything else. Maybe that tinfoil hat wasn't a bad idea after all. But what if it traps it inside so that it just cooks your brain even more efficiently? Of course. What's happening with COVID in Asian countries? There are a number of different responses that are taking place in different places for different reasons, and it's interesting to see it playing out. It's not necessarily predictable, just like in Europe, for example. I certainly wouldn't have predicted at the beginning of the year that Sweden would have been the one to avoid the lockdowns and harsh mandates. I wouldn't have predicted at the start of this year that Japan would be similarly the Asian country that seems to have avoided lockdowns and other hysteria the most of any of its near neighbors. I find that to be interesting, but that may just be happenstance of the ways that the testing is being done or not done, or the particularities of who happens to be in power at any particular moment. So I can't say that there's a singular response that has been exhibited, but I do find it interesting that, of course, at the beginning of whatever happened there in Wuhan, we were seeing those dramatic images of people being sealed in their apartments, and there was videos circulating on social media of people flopping to the ground, blood spurting out their nose, and that sort of thing. That seems to have, evaporated completely. It certainly didn't eventuate anywhere else, and the only thing we got were those videos that were coming out of China. Was any of that real? What was happening there? So is China really pretty much business as usual now, as it seems to be the case? And so what really happened, and why did everyone follow China's example there so closely? I think there's a lot of things that are going to be, well, I would like to say that the history books will come to some sort of decision, but unfortunately history books tend to be written by the winners, so we may never have the definitive answers on that. But I think, again, China's response to all of this over the past year has been very interesting and perhaps indicative of the way that things were going to go generally. And the real question is why? Why does the World Health Organization and others defer to the Chinese government so much on these matters? Elon Musk on Twitter has been shining a light on suspect COVID testing. Could this be the beginning of the end for lockdowns, face masks, and social controls? I would like to think so, but I do not think so. If people have been following Elon Musk on Twitter, for example, they will see that the pushback against his doubts about the testing process and other such things has been enormous, and a lot of people are basically accusing him of being irresponsible and he shouldn't be tweeting these things. So I don't think that Elon Musk is really pushing the needle that dramatically in terms of general public opinion about these things. I would invite people to look at the actual data as opposed to looking at Elon Musk or any other particular celebrity or businessman or anyone else and taking their word for this matter. I think that's actually what has put us into this problem in the first place, is people trusting authorities rather than actually examining data for themselves. So, no, I don't think Elon Musk is particularly going to change things one way or another, but hopefully will at least incite a few people who, I know there are a lot of Elon Musk fanboys out there, perhaps they will at least be encouraged to actually look at the data that underlines what he's trying to point out there.
U.S. stock markets are hitting all-time highs. Stock markets are said to predict the future. What do you think they see ahead?
Well, for the last several years, as I've been saying, I think we're living in the reality inversion bubble where bad news is good news and good news is bad news for the markets. So to the extent that the markets can see the future or predict the future, I think that's only true in terms of what they predict about what central banks' reactions to various things will be. So I think that this is a lot of baking into the cake, stimulus and low interest and let the good times continue to roll, along with a little bit of enthusiasm about pronouncements, literally corporate PR from Pfizer and others about the effectiveness of these vaccines. I think there will be, contrary to what the markets are at least seeming to do at the moment, I think there will be some harsher reality setting in soon. And we're starting to see perhaps the beginnings of that taking hold in the market. So we'll see how this eventuates. But I think ultimately what markets are doing is pricing in stimulus and status quo. And I don't think that's what is really in the cards. So I think people would be best advised not necessarily to bet against the markets in all respects, but at least to hold some skepticism about the enthusiasm that traders seem to be displaying right now.
An online comment suggested 60 to 70% of people are stupid. Your thoughts?
I don't really know what to say to that, other than to say that that's the old Carlin bit about think of how dumb the average person is and then think half of people are dumber than that. But it's a little bit easy, isn't it, to simply say that I am the fount of all knowledge and wisdom and everyone else is dumb. I actually find that rhetoric quite divisive and contrary to what the message that ultimately I want to put out there, which is that I actually trust that people are smart enough to run their own lives. And at the very least, maybe they will do a terrible job of doing that, but it will be their decision to decide what is best for them, not some authority, not some expert, not some person in a white lab coat telling you what to think or believe, but you yourself coming to your own conclusions. And I do have faith in people out there to be able to do that. So I don't like to talk down to people like that. And, I'm sure we all know people that we consider to be stupid, but let's put it in perspective. I'm sure there are people out there that think I am stupid or fill in the blank for anyone else in the audience. So it's all a matter of perspectives, and different people have different things that they want out of life, and so I'm not going to judge that. Which was a very deep and philosophical response to that question, wasn't it?
Well, I once heard that anybody who drives faster than you is an idiot, and anyone who drives slower is a moron. Same philosophy.
Resonates with me very well, yes. I think I say that on the roads every single day.
Where can people follow you and see your documentary work?
They can follow me at corbettreport.com. That's CORBETT report.com. I am on a number of different social media platforms, but the easiest way to find my work is corbettreport.com. And if you're interested in my documentaries in particular, which I think are important, and I hope do have some information out there for people, there is a link on the sidebar of corbettreport.com to my documentary specifically. So if you want to get more in-depth on this type of material, including one that I think is particularly relevant to today's conversation called Who is Bill Gates, that I released earlier this year.
I was just going to ask you, who made Bill Gates a second-rate computer programmer into an expert on viruses?
I don't know, but apparently he's the microbiologist we should all be breathlessly listening to. I have a hunch that billions upon billions of dollars of paid PR propaganda has a good effect on one's perception, on people's perception of your relative level of ability and things that you haven't actually researched. But I'll just leave that out there.
James, thank you so much for being on This Week in Money.
Thank you for having me on. Always a pleasure.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com. He was speaking to us from Japan, where he has worked and lived since 2004. Originally, he's from my hometown, Calgary. Coming up, John Rubino, next on This Week in Money.
Engineer Gold Mines is focused on the exploration and development of the historic high-grade Engineer Gold Mine situated 32 kilometers southwest of Atlan, British Columbia. Engineer Gold Mines is fully permitted for surface and underground exploration with the drill program now underway. Engineer Gold Mines Limited trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol EAU. For more information, please visit us at engineergoldmines.com.
This Week in Money is archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com.
My guest is John Rubino, author of several books on the economy, including The Money Bubble, his website, dollarcollapse.com. Welcome back to the show, John.
Hey, Jim. Good to be back.
The U.S. dollar, is it taking it on the chin, and what's the outlook for the U.S. buck?
Well, yeah, it's dropping a little bit after a really strong year, strong relative to other currencies. The dollar's never really strong versus real stuff. Every year, the price of most things goes up, which is to say the value of the dollar goes down. But it's happening in a, fairly controlled way, 2 or 3% each year. And other currencies are in even worse shape in a lot of cases, so it makes the dollar look quote unquote strong. Now, not so much. And, part of that is that, we're not looking so good with this election. All of a sudden, it turns out that not only can't we do a lot of other things, but we can't even run an election like a regular modern country. So I think our reputation is suffering a bit in the world, and that translates into a weaker currency, because if you don't trust the issuer of the currency to be halfway competent, then it's hard to trust the currency. So, that's a danger for the dollar, because we're making so many mistakes beyond this election. Financially, we're screwing up pretty much every way you can think of. And eventually, that's going to come back to haunt the dollar. Although, again, a lot of other countries are just as mismanaged. So it's not clear which currency is going to crash first, but most of them are headed for, the trash bin of history.
When that happens, what does that do to the U.S. economy? And, of course, Canada's so closely tied, the Canadian economy.
Well, it throws us into chaos, because so much of what we do depends on a functioning currency. And, your listeners of a certain age will remember what happened in the 1970s, which is our last episode that's similar to what's coming here, when there were oil shocks and political issues and government overspending and blah, blah, blah. Just, went on and on. Our problems did. And the dollar started to fall. And inflation started to pick up. We had like 14% inflation at the peak, and the dollar was crashing, and oil was spiking, and gold and silver were going through the roof. And that was at a time when our finances were actually in reasonably good shape. We weren't over indebted back then. So now, when things get volatile, it's going to be in the context of the U.S. and much of Europe and much of Asia being wildly over-indebted, and because of that being really financially fragile. When you have cash on hand and no debt, you can handle stuff in your life, right? Same thing for a country. If you've got a rock-solid balance sheet, then you can handle complexity. But if you're deeply indebted and a lot of entities within a society are wildly over-indebted besides the central government, then you're fragile. You can't handle crises nearly as easily. And so that's what we're heading into, something like the 1970s, but with us being in much worse shape. And therefore, it's going to be a lot more chaotic.
We keep hearing of the scenario where the government's going to seize all private property and assets and then just give you a monthly stipend to live on, and you'll be, quote, happy with that. Is that going to happen?
The Great Reset. Yeah,
the Great Reset.
That's a fantasy of the 1% who are watching the world and thinking, I've stolen enough, and now I think I need to impose stability on the rest of society. And I'm going to do that by taking away what's left of the freedoms of the 99%. And, some of what they want to do is okay. I mean, a dramatic transition to alternative energy will, on balance, be a very good thing. And lower population growth would be great. If we could, in a coherent way, without infringing on everybody's basic civil rights, shrink the human population by 2/3, the world would be a better place. But to do it via a dictatorship is probably not going to be something that most people will find acceptable. So, it's one of the battles coming up. And, the question becomes, is a lot of what's happening now engineered in order to make that kind of a transition via, a global dictatorship easier to pull off? Or is it just, accidental because we borrowed too much money? And I don't know. I really don't know what the answer is. I don't have any inside information, and there's evidence supporting both scenarios, and I don't know which is scarier.
If you believe the U.S. dollar's in deep trouble, along with several other currencies, and I guess the Canadian dollar would get sucked down if America doesn't succeed, what can a person do to protect themselves?
Well, the first thing you need to do is recognize that you can't stop what's coming. I mean, this stuff is... it has such institutional momentum. Whoever's in charge of the U.S. and most other countries is going to borrow insane amounts of money going forward and force the central bank to create enough new currency to cover the debts that they took on. That's going to happen no matter what, and it's going to have the effects it always has had throughout history, no matter what, which is to say the currency is going to become volatile and then collapse. So what you as an individual can do is try to protect yourself and your family's finances, first of all, from what's coming by shifting out of investments that depend on the value of the currency. For instance, a government bond derives its value from the currency that it pays you. With a government bond, you've lent money to the government and they're paying you back in the national currency. If the national currency starts to lose value, then that government bond loses value too. So you don't want to be in bond funds or money market funds or bank accounts if you can help it. And you'd be much better off in gold and silver as your cash savings. That is, where you would normally keep dollars that you can get at. You keep gold and silver. And then gold and silver mining stocks would be a good replacement for most other investments because what they've got in the ground, gold and silver, will tend to go up in value in the scenario we're talking about. And they can make you money, where gold and silver bullion, gold and silver coins, will protect your capital. The mining stocks will increase your capital. So if you have a portfolio that is weighted in that direction, that is real assets, rather than financial assets, you'll probably come through this in reasonably good shape. And then there are a lot of personal things you can do too. If you have any specific questions on those subjects, I'd be happy to answer them, Jim.
Well, I've heard the basic thing is pay off your debts, don't live beyond your means, have some cash readily available if you need to grab it, and not rely on electronic transfer, because if there's a power failure or some kind of massive pulse that takes out the power grid for a month or two, you'll need to have some cash on hand.
Yeah, that's all absolutely true, because not only if there's an interruption in trading, there could also be confiscation electronically, because if, for instance, the Fed is getting ready to start direct depositing money into the accounts of people. What a lot of people don't know is that if someone has the ability to deposit money in your bank account, they also have the ability to withdraw money from your bank account. So your bank account may not be safe anymore. And the same thing with your brokerage account. If that account gets hacked or the government decides to go in there and confiscate stuff, there's nothing you can really do about it. So you want cash on hand. Yeah, and that's where gold and silver come in. Because if you have gold and silver coins stored in a very safe place that hardly anybody knows about it, you've got capital that doesn't depend on anybody else keeping a promise. In other words, there's no counterparty risk with cash, especially in the form of gold and silver. And then you can use that to get through the immediate impact of all the crazy stuff that's coming. Now, as for your stocks, that's a little trickier. It is possible to get the stocks, get your brokerage house to sign the stocks over to you, and then give you the certificates. And it's actually not that complicated, but most people just never bother to do it because it's relatively inconvenient. But you can do that, and in that way you lower the risk of the government just confiscating stuff like that from you. So I know it's a shame that we have to think in these terms, but that's how crazy the world has gotten. You know, these things are real issues all of a sudden, which comes from the big systems being screwed up and you know, people no longer being able to trust the banks and the brokerage houses and the government, and not even in a lot of cases the police and the fire department. So that's just the world we've created for ourselves, or allowed to be created through our own inaction, and now we have to deal with it. Now, in terms of what you do with your personal life, in situations like this, you need to be part of a community. So one of the things that you definitely should be doing is connecting with the people around you. You want to know your neighbors, and you want to be able to count on them. And in order for you to count on them, they have to be able to count on you. So you've got to make connections that involve some obligation on your part, but also some protection from other people in case you get into some kind of trouble. And you need to take steps on your job, not just to show up and do your 8 hours of work and go home, but to make yourself indispensable, because in really chaotic times, no job is safe. But if you can do 2 or 3 things at work, and you've got a rep for stepping up when something needs to be done, then you've got a better chance of surviving a round of job cuts than your lazier coworkers. So you've got to be doing that too, more so than normal. I mean, you know, a lot of this stuff is what we should have always been doing, like having a garden. You know, we should have all been growing our own food to the extent that we can do it. And now it's important. You know, it's a survival thing now. Before it was a, you know, convenience thing. Just, it's nice to have tomatoes fresh off the vine and stuff like that. But now it's, you know, who knows if the food supply chain is going to stay the way it has been. So maybe you might have to actually eat what you've canned this winter. And so these are all things we should be doing. And it kind of sounds like we should all be preppers, you know. Sounds like that's what I'm describing. And, you know, it kind of is. You know, we should all be adopting aspects of the whole survivalist prepper ethos. Because all of a sudden it's becoming important for regular people, you know, people who aren't envisioning a Mad Max scenario where they have to fight for their lives, but who can now envision disruptions in the food supply chain, or mass layoffs, or civil unrest. We need to be taking steps to protect ourselves personally from stuff like that.
We'll have more with John Rubino right after this.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com. This Week in Money is archived online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with John Rubino. John, one of the headlines says Fed head Jerome Powell sees a new economy. What is that new economy, and should we be concerned about it?
You know, when people from the Fed talk, you should almost always either not listen or believe the opposite of whatever they're saying, because they have a job, which is in a fiat currency system where the currency depends for its value on our perception that the people in charge know what they're doing. It's really important for the people in charge to say reassuring things. So, you know, to the extent that Jerome Powell is talking about big changes in the economy, that's pretty serious, because, you know, he wouldn't do that if there's any way to avoid it. Because normally they basically come out and say focus grouped things designed to make the stock market go up. And, you know, to the extent that he's sending out even a veiled warning. That's a big deal. But he should be warning us, because he just presided over the biggest debt increase of any country in the history of the human race in the U.S. this year. We took on a massive amount of debt. We ran a deficit at the federal level of like 10% of GDP. And most other sectors of the economy borrowed a lot of money too, especially corporations, but also students and in a lot of cases consumers. So we were already very deeply in debt. Now we're even more deeply in debt. And Jerome Powell, as the head of the Fed, is supposed to manage the results of that somehow. And that means even lower interest rates, but interest rates are already at zero. So what's he going to do? We found out in Europe and Japan that you can have negative interest rates and not implode. But they're coming to the conclusion that it also doesn't really do you much good. So it's not clear what the Fed has left to do. And this could be his way of putting pressure on the federal government to run bigger deficits and bail everybody out. Because that might be what we have to do. Well, what is perceived that we have to do going forward, where instead of monetary policy, which is what we used to bail ourselves out from our financial mismanagement in the past, now we're going to have to go back to fiscal policy where we got to run big deficits and give that money to people to keep them from going bankrupt. So yeah, just as a general rule, don't listen to the Fed, but if they ever say anything that is in any way scary, then you should take notice, because they don't normally do that. And when they do, it means they don't feel comfortable saying the usual focus group stuff because they're very worried.
Do governments actually borrow real money, go to Bank X, borrow so many $1 billion and say we'll pay it back to you at X interest rate, or do they just fire up the printing presses and print out more dollars?
Well, see, back when we had a real financial system where the money was linked to something like gold, that limited the creation of new money. That's what governments had to do. Like if they wanted to fight a war or start a new entitlement or something like that, they actually had to go get money from somewhere. They had to raise taxes from their citizens, or yes, they had to borrow it in a public way from people who actually wanted to be paid back. And the central bank was unable just to create new money out of thin air to pay all that back off. But those days are long gone. Now they just make money up out of thin air. Literally, I'm not even exaggerating here. If the Fed wants to give J.P. Morgan Chase $1 trillion, they have one of their technicians type $1 trillion into a screen and hit send, and then J.P. Morgan Chase's balance sheet has another $1 trillion. That's all it is. It's electronic play money now. And if you give that power to politicians and bureaucrats, human nature being what it is, they're going to abuse that policy, right? And so they have been abusing it for the past 40 years, really ever since 1971, when we went off the last vestiges of the gold standard, and definitely since 1980, when Ronald Reagan in the U.S. ran massive deficits and found out that there's no real political downside to it. You don't get voted out of office if you run deficits anymore, and he's the guy who made that point, and everybody else since then has run with it. They just spend whatever they feel like, and the inevitable result of borrowing and spending whatever you feel like is some kind of financial catastrophe. So that's where we are. And next year is a really interesting year because the pandemic came along and basically bankrupted a lot of entities out there. Chicago and Illinois and California and New York and New Jersey, they're all kind of bankrupt right now because they aren't making enough in tax revenues to cover their expenses. And then the airline industry and the hotel industry and the cruise industry and most restaurants, it goes on and on. They're all bankrupt. So whatever administration is in charge in January in the U.S. is going to have to face a really interesting choice, whether they bail out everybody in sight by borrowing another $10 trillion or so dollars, or trying to avoid insane amounts of borrowing at the risk of letting big sectors of the economy just go bankrupt. So this is going to be a fascinating year because either thing they do carries huge risks and, a lot of unintended consequences, obviously. and they don't really know which to choose. I suspect they'll do the bailout thing, but it's not a done deal that that's what's going to happen. So this is going to be a fascinating year, and it's going to compress, the next 5 or 10 years, what would have happened, into 1 year as far as financial mismanagement goes. So, I'm watching this with interest, but also with, a lot of anxiety.
Also, we've seen the changing face of work with so many offices closed, people working from home. Is that a permanent situation now? These companies are finding out they don't need to spend all that overhead on office space.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies found out, hey, I really don't need that guy here every day. I can just pull him up on Zoom, see what he's up to, and then let him go back to work. And it saves his commute. It saves us some office space. So let's just do it en masse. Working at home, that was also a trend that was in place, right? More and more people were working at home. But the pandemic compressed the next 5 or 10 years into 1 year. So it's going to be kind of a step function now where, okay, we were trending up and now we jump up to this new higher level of people working at home. And that becomes the new normal. So, that's another interesting thing that's happening. That's bad for commercial real estate and good for housing because more and more people need, a house with an office, or they don't have to live in the city anymore, so they can go out to the suburbs where things cost half as much. So it's causing a big transition in the housing market too. At the same time, it's bankrupting a lot of commercial real estate developers and managers. So again, the next decade or so has been compressed into a year, and big changes are happening. And it's not clear, what all the consequences of those changes will be, but we'll find out soon.
What happens to these big city cores that are mostly just office towers that clear out at 5 o'clock and then they become ghost towns? Vancouver's an exception to that. They have a lot of people who live downtown, but other places don't. Does that mean the big city is dead?
Well, it means a lot of them face a lot of challenges because you've got to be a really appealing big city, given the civil unrest that happened just lately here in the U.S., and the fact that the mayors and the police pretty much let it happen. If you had a small business in downtown Chicago or Portland or Seattle or someplace like that, you feel like you've been betrayed by the people you used to count on. So it's no longer necessarily in your interest to live there and work there. And, I think that idea is spreading. So a lot of cities are going to see an exodus. And a lot of suburbs and smaller but very livable cities and towns are going to see an inflow of people. And it's pretty dangerous. If you're a New York City real estate developer, you got to be terrified right now because, rents are plunging. Office occupancy rates are way down. Hotel rates are way down. And it's not clear that they snap right back. They'll probably trend back from this level, but it could be that they never get back to 2019 levels again. And what happens if you borrowed a ton of money to buy those buildings and renovate them and everything? It's possible you can't pay that off. So we could see a lot of bankruptcies of developers and landlords in these cities, and then we could see the cities themselves in a lot of cases go bankrupt, because Chicago was already going to go bankrupt, but now it's going to go bankrupt right away. Unless they get a bailout next year, they literally will have to declare bankruptcy, and they'll default on all their loans, and they'll stiff their retirees, and on and on. It's going to be a brutal thing because they owe a ton of money. And Illinois is in not much better shape than Chicago. And then a lot of other cities and states are in almost as bad a shape as those guys. So, it's going to be a fascinating year. We really have to borrow a ton of money to fix all this or paper all this over, or we need to let it burn, and it's kind of what they were facing in the West for the last few years with all these fires. Do we put them out and then risk even bigger fires next year, or do we just let them burn and get all the underbrush out? Well, there are financial analogs to that, and we're looking at one now with a lot of this really bad debt that's out there. Either we take that debt onto the federal balance sheet, which then shifts the pressure over to the dollar and maybe gives us a currency crisis, or we let these really mismanaged entities just go bankrupt and let people with capital come in and buy them out and run them better. Personally, I would like to see the latter.
A lot of studies showed that businesses and banks that were bailed out after 2008's financial crisis probably should have failed. It would have been better economically. Is that what you foresee in the future?
Oh, that would have been so much better. If we would have let Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase and Citigroup go bankrupt, the world would be so much a better place. Because what we did? We bailed them out with trillions of dollars of taxpayer money, and then they paid themselves at the end of that very year when they got the bailouts. They paid their executives record high bonuses. And which is basically them just kind of, making an obscene gesture at the rest of society and saying, you know what, we're bulletproof. You can't touch us. So the lesson they learned from that was that they are bulletproof. They can do anything they want to. So they've just gone on with their, excessive risk-taking ways and excessive control of the government. And we would be in so much better shape right now if we'd let them go bankrupt and then let everyone else learn that lesson. They would have been an object lesson for all the other potentially badly managed companies out there.
John, over the last weekend, China, Australia, New Zealand, a number of Asian-based or Pacific Rim countries signed a new trade deal promising to get rid of tariffs. Did Canada and the U.S. miss the boat on that, or did we avoid a bullet?
Well, it's perceived in the U.S. by maybe 49% of the population that these trade deals were not a good deal for us. Because basically we leveled the playing field with countries whose workers earn 1/5 as much as our workers earn. So what ended up happening here was that all the pretty good high-paying, unionized factory jobs just disappeared. And we created a whole generation of borderline destitute people who used to be making middle-class money. And, they're not happy about it, understandably. So the whole trade thing, no matter who's in charge of the U.S. next year, the whole trade thing is going to have to be thought through. And I'm not sure what answer we're going to come to, because being part of a big free trade area has a lot of advantages. But protecting some of your crucial industries also has a lot of advantages. And there's a big political constituency now for going back to some measure of protectionism. So that'll also be interesting to see how it works out. But and I don't know whether the North American free trade zone is going to be big enough in the coming world to offset something like giant Asia and Asian trading bloc, or Europe, or whether these big blocs eventually start cutting deals with each other and we end up with one big world free trade zone. I don't know. I don't know how this is going to play out. But I think that the people who are kind of free traders in the U.S. see what happened in Asia as ominous, because they see that as that part of the world going in the right direction while we're regressing. I used to be a pretty extreme free trader, and now I recognize the downside of a lot of our policies, and so I'm kind of trying to decide what I think about trade, because it's not clear that there's one right answer, and it's not clear that which group should be favored over which other group when we're formulating trade policy. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer for what the Asian free trade zone means exactly, but I think we'll find out in the next few years.
As a consumer, of course, you want to save as much money as you can, but do you mind paying $1 or $2 more for something that's a little more expensive if it's locally or at least North American made? I mean, that's a decision we have to make.
Yeah, and I kind of do now. I try to buy local and buy things that were made in the U.S., even if they cost a little more, because I think that puts money in the pockets of people who are nearby, which is something that is in each of our interests, right? I mean, that's, in buying something that's made locally, you're getting something. So you're getting that product, but you're also getting a better local economy and more successful people around you, which is a good thing. That's the kind of community that you want to live in. So there are really now two motivations when we buy stuff. One is, what do we want to get? And the other is, what kind of a community do we want to create with our money? And I think more and more people are coming to the conclusion that the second thing is actually as or more important than the first thing, right? That you want to live in a vibrant community where people have control over their lives and are doing interesting things and getting paid for it, more than you want to have a bunch of cheap stuff that was made in China in slave labor factories, So I think we're kind of waking up to the fact that we're voting with our dollars when we buy things, and we're voting about several different things at the same time. So that's good to the extent that a lot of people are kind of figuring that out now.
John, before we go, could you tell us a bit about your book, The Money Bubble?
Yeah, that's co-written with Gold Money's James Turk, and we wrote it in 2014, but it's just now starting. Its dire predictions are just now starting to come true. So it's actually still a timely book because it was too early. And most of what we talk about in there is still valid, although the numbers are a lot bigger now, So all the stuff that we predicted, which is a big currency crisis and gold and silver going through the roof and mining stocks being the best thing to invest in, all of that is starting to happen. So the book is still very timely, and, it's still available out there. You can buy it on Amazon, or you can go to dollarcollapse.com and you'll see an ad for it there that you can click on.
And also with your website, dollarcollapse.com, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that's a blog/news aggregation site that covers a lot of the stuff that you and I just talked about in a continuously updated way. And I've got a join the mailing list button there that you click on and put your email address in there, and then you'll get whatever I write personally for free from now on.
John, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thanks, Jim.
My guest has been John Rubino, author of several books on the economy, including The Money Bubble, his website, dollarcollapse.com. And that wraps up our show for this week. We'd like to thank our guests, Bob Hoye, James Corbett, and John Rubino. And thank you for listening. If you have any questions for the show or our guests, you can send them to info@howestreet.com. Now stand by for a company showcase update from American Manganese President Larry Reaugh. I'm Jim Goddard. We'll be back next week with more This Week in Money.
Comments made on This Week in Money are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any manner whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com. This Week in Money is a production of Howe Street Media Incorporated. Executive producer is Tom Allen. Welcome to Company Showcase, an advertising feature on HoweStreet.com.
I'm Jim Goddard. I'm speaking with Larry Reaugh, CEO and President of American Manganese. Welcome back to the show, Larry.
Always a pleasure, Jim.
Quiet in your office last week, but you were very busy this week. What happened?
Oh, yeah. We had a couple of press releases out there, and actually more than a couple, but two that were germane. And, one of them was basically the closing of the private placement. We took in a third tranche, decided to close it, and we got about $1.43 million dollars. So, that'll feed us through to the next round of testing, and perhaps, I'm hoping that we'll start get started on the final design. But what people have to realize is that we're basically working this project like we want to be the leader in recoveries and sales, and in order to do that, we've got to have a pretty tight ship, and this particle size and everything else very important, and it's something that we have to get done, because that gets you the best price. And it can be a few times higher than the ordinary commodity prices. So that makes it imperative that we nail that down, and that's what the battery manufacturers want now. So I think I've mentioned in my podcast several times that the sand keeps shifting, and it certainly has shifted a long ways from the first time we got the idea and did our testing to show that we could do it. The proof of concept, the basic landscape has totally shifted around 180 degrees. It now depends on not what you can recover, not what the purities are, which is still important, which we've already covered off, getting ready to design our plant. And then after interaction with some of the battery manufacturers, we found that they were concerned about the particle size. And so that took a while to scope the landscape to find something that works. And we did. We have delivery of it, and but the training on it is tied up with the COVID-19. And so it'll be a little while before that gets started. And but, the thing is that you can produce what they want. Eventually, the better mousetrap will, bring people in. And that's exactly what we're building. I mean, we've got a solid recycling program. This other piece is an add-on that works with the particle size and everything else. I'm not sure what that will add to the cost. But it will add to the cost and the design, so that's got to be done. And then we're in a position to hopefully, get some battery suppliers interested in what we're doing, and they should be. The point is that they should be concerned about recycling to start with. They should be concerned about getting the final product that they want. And it puts us in the same category as a battery material supplier, like the cathode metals and the anode metals and everything. It puts us into that category. And, certainly battery manufacturer should look at this as an opportunity. And so we're hoping that something will happen there. And we just got to keep plugging ahead. We also announced in conjunction with the reactor that the IRAP is going to fund the research work on that, and so we don't have to dip into our own treasury to do that. But we've been supported by the U.S. and Canadian governments all the way through. They like what we have, so it's. Getting it through to the market is another problem. Like I said, a week ago, we average about 140 million shares a year on the U.S. and Canadian exchanges. And yet, it would seem like there's just hundreds or billions of shares of stock available for sale, and you know where that comes from. That's the predators. And I know that they don't like me mentioning it, but it happens to be the truth. These guys are, destroying company values all over the place to fill their own pockets, and they got no concern for the shareholders. And most of them are in the community. So it's just something that you have to work your way through, and we will work our way through that. And hopefully they'll get trapped like they did in 2016. And be forced to cover. So that's the plan going forward, is to keep optimizing everything that we have, optimizing our IR, optimizing all the social media that we use. And I had an email last night from a guy that said, I think it was probably from BMN, that had a little blurb on their company out of Alberta, and he's wondering why we hadn't. Well, we've used them a lot of times, and The market has to be right. You got to have buyers that are looking at it. Right now, most of the buyers are sitting on the fence, so we'll just plow through all that. But other than that, it's we've got a secure program. We've got a good plan going forward, and we've trying to cover our bases as best we can. And we keep moving ahead, and the key to the whole thing is the patents that we own, and those patents will bar anybody else from using our process. Although there's a few that tried, and we're pushing back on that, and so it's interesting. It's always busy in here. We've got a skeleton staff, and we may have to start doing a little increasing on that. But the point is that we try to stay lean and mean, put our money into the project, and not into the management's pockets. And so we just keep moving ahead, Jim, and so it's been a good week. We had a good volume yesterday, over 700,000 shares on both the U.S. and the Canadian exchange. Unfortunately, a lot of that is arbitrage. And but what can I say? All we can do is bring out the best product, and at the end of the day, all these hundreds of recycling companies out there, there's going to be a lot of batteries. I mean, countries are looking at moving the date to 2030 on when it's all electric, and that just means more batteries, more scraps to secure, and basically turn it back into cathode materials, precursor materials. So. It's an interesting time, and the market for cobalt and nickel and lithium and all those is up. They've increased significantly, and so it says that the battery manufacturers are in build mode, and that's got to be good for us, Jim.
Larry, for people new to American Manganese, what's the company all about, and where are you traded, and where can they get more information?
We're traded on the TSX Venture Exchange, and under the symbol AMY. We're traded in the U.S. under the symbol AMYZF, and we're traded in Frankfurt under the symbol 2AM. The company is a critical metals company that, in reality, is started its career as developing a patented formula for treating low grades of ore, which the U.S. has, and then we moved on to cathode materials, and we certainly got those two patents through in a big hurry, so nobody else was encroaching in that area, and so it's. And now we're on to recycling, and recycling is very important. I mean, if you want to save the environment, you got to get as much. You got to take as much as you can out without putting anything back, and that's exactly what our process does. You can get all that information on our site, AmericanManganeseInc.com, and you can also phone the office here at 778-574-4444. And you can email me at LREAUGH@AMYMN.com.
Larry, thank you so much for the update.
You're welcome.
My guest has been Larry Reaugh, CEO and President of American Manganese. I'm Jim Goddard. Our conversation took place on November 20th.
Comments made on Company Showcase are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any manner whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Archived online at HowStreet.com. Company Showcase is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.